because we are matching up, squaring up to where we get to the events of the crucifixion / resurrection as we move to the Easter season and get right in the middle of it. 7, 8, and 9 is a big mood swing. It's kind of like, this is a bad analogy, but it's kind of like the Hallmark movie where everything's been going right, and then you know it has to do what? It's got to go wrong, because it just has to. It's the Hallmark movie. Well, 7, 8, and 9, this is where it starts to go wrong. Now, what happens before that? A man is healed who's been at the pool for 38 years. And Jesus says, well, why don't you just get up and walk? He goes and starts to walk, and we're going to find that as a result of that, he is actually kicked out of the temple and told you can't come back, because he says, well, there was this man, and they didn't want to hear anything about it. So that was one of the things. 5,000 people are fed. The 5,000 people, it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. They have to pick up the bread. There's no fish left, because these are all people from South Louisiana, and they ate the fish and they left the bread, and which is what I would do too if it was all I could eat. I'm going for the fish. And so some of the bread was left over. It says it was 12 baskets full. Well, at this time, they were ready to make Jesus king, which means they were just going to just kind of march him, parade him into Jerusalem, tell Herod, you got to go, and institute. And he says, no, that's not the way this is supposed to work. He goes up on a mountain, prays for a while. Disciples head across the lake. They're going to Capernaum, and Jesus decides to go meet them, walks across the water. Some people say that's ridiculous. Well, not if you created water. It was his to create, so he can do with it what he wanted to. And the crowds that had been fed found out that he was across the lake, so they're still coming. And it says there's this huge group of people that are there. And now he starts to say things that are not what people want to hear. So here's the first point. A lot of times what we do with the Jesus that we create is we focus on one part of him, and then when we get there, we don't really know what to do with the rest of it, because we make Jesus kind of to be like a cardboard figure instead of a real person. So we're going to get into that. But looking at John 7, 8, and 9, if up until then, up until John 6, it's kind of like the season of success. But in John 7, 8, and 9, it's where the enemies start to arise. Now, here's one thing you need to know, because it tells us this in Scripture. It says all of this took place at the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, what was that? Because if you don't understand that, it takes away from the story of John. Well, the Feast of Tabernacles was an 8-day celebration. It was primarily to celebrate two things. Number one, the Exodus from Egypt, which is one of the huge things in the Jewish scheme of things. The second thing was to celebrate the harvest for that year. So the Feast of Tabernacles, and the reason they called it the Feast of Tabernacles is because everybody comes to Jerusalem and they built little tents or tabernacles out of wood, camps, we'd call them today. They built these little small structures that they stayed in for a few days, and these were the tabernacles. It's very possible, this is just interesting, that because we don't really know the birthday of Jesus, but it's very possible that it would have been during the Feast of Tabernacles, because in John 1 it says that he dwelt with us, and the word dwelt is tabernacled. He tabernacled with us. So it could be that John was kind of going, all of this was taking place at the same time, or at the same place on the calendar. But anyway, several days, joyous celebration. Everyone returns. They camp out for those 7 days. All right, so in these chapters where the enemies arise, Jesus refers to himself as the living water. That's in John 7:38. And the light of the world. That's in John 8:12 and 9:5. Now in 8:12, when he calls himself the light of the world, the first thing that he does is he heals a blind man. You think there's any relationship to that? I was blind, but now I see. So he calls himself the light of the world. Then he goes and heals the blind man. We're going to come back to him. So here's what happened in the Feast of Tabernacles. Number one, it was 8 days. There are some 2nd century notes from rabbis that tell us this. In the Feast of Tabernacles, there was water. There was a water that was used from the pool of Siloam, Siloam, and this water was drank, and it was part of the ceremony. This kind of goes back to what we see in Isaiah 12, if you want to write that down and look at it later. Isaiah 12, chapter 3, verse 3, excuse me, chapter 12, verse 3. It says, with joy you will draw from the water of the wells of salvation. So this was a long tradition that went with the Feast of Tabernacles. The temple was there. Everybody would take water out of this. It was a celebration. Well, that went on until the last day of the festival. On the last day of the festival, no one drank from the pool. And this is what it says in verse 37. On the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice. So now you know, on the last and greatest, this was the 8th day. Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoa. They have been taking this water and celebrating. Today, they're not taking the water and celebrating. Jesus stands up in the middle of this celebration and says, anyone who's thirsty, come to me and drink. And it says that they would have rivers of living water flow from them. And by that, he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive, because up until that time, the Spirit had not been given since Jesus had not been glorified. So here we have this notion of we're going to celebrate with this water, which is a remembrance of the fact that we've just had a great harvest and we've been delivered from, our ancestors were delivered from bondage. But we don't drink it on this day. And then this is the day that Jesus says, the greatest day, says, I'm the water. You need to drink from me. It gets better. During this time of the celebration, there would have been a giant, bright candle holder that would have been in the temple. It would have been lit. And this thing would have been it would have been a celebration that reminds them that they had left Egypt and that they just had a great harvest. On the last day, it was not lit. It was not lit because this was a symbol of God's unfulfilled promises, the flames yet to come, if you will. So the candle would have been, a candelabra would have been bare. Nothing's happening there. And in 8:12, chapter 8, verse 12, on that very day where there's no candle lit, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. The picture's clear. The service was supposed to be of darkness, that you're remembering God still had unfinished business, and Jesus proclaims himself as the light of the world. He is clearly establishing himself as I am the person who you have been looking for. Jesus had a penchant for healing on the Sabbath. It happened more than one time. When he was doing that, and what he's saying in so many words is, I own the Sabbath. The Sabbath does not own me. I made the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is something that I have control over. So Jesus says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. He also makes it clear that he is the fulfillment of the Passover. We're going to see that a little bit later, but he's already started bringing it up when he said, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood if you want any kind of forgiveness at all. And of course, he's already called himself living water, so we ought to be able to see from his examples, he's not talking about actual flesh and blood. But what he is talking about is the Passover ceremony. The Passover ceremony was this whole notion that Egypt was celebrating what? Deliverance. We have been delivered. We have been passed over. And Jesus is going to ultimately say that what has happened with my body is that if you use my body in the same way you use the Passover, if you sprinkle my blood above your doorstep, then you too will be passed over. You have a chance to be redeemed. He's saying that the Passover was always about him. You say, But how do we know that? Well, one of the reasons we know that is he says, this is my body broken for you. That had never been said in a Passover meal. Nobody said their body was broken for the people that were following them. And then he said, this is my blood shed for the remission of sins. That had never been said in a Passover meal, especially when he's holding up the cup of redemption, which would have been the third cup of the meal. He drinks a little bit of it and he said, this is my blood shed for you. Well, it's clearly not his blood because that was yet to come. But what he's saying is, when you do this in remembrance of me. That's not about just, it's about do this in remembrance of all the things that I have done to demonstrate that I am who I said I was. So he fulfills the Passover. He fulfills the Sabbath. And he fulfills the Feast of Tabernacles when he says, I'm the water, not that water in that well. You're going to the wrong water. I'm the water that gives life. I'm the light, not that candle. That candle makes light, but I am the light. And so he says he fulfills the Feast of Tabernacles. And of course he was saying, I am. Now we all know that I am is a what? Shortcut for Yahweh. It is a term of divinity. And the build-up to all that I am's is really in chapter 7. It starts and it's just, man, it's gut-wrenching. And this is where some of us need to start paying attention because we wonder, gee, if I'm a Christian, how come everything's not all hunky and dory? It says this at the beginning of John 7. It says his own family tried to belittle him. Why don't you go do some of those signs and wonders, Jesus? Why don't you come with us? Come with us to the feast. Why don't you go do some of this stuff? People need to see it. Why don't you go in town and do a few miracles? Show the world who you really are. His own brothers did not believe in him. You say, wow. Well, in Mark 3, we get the same picture. Man comes down through the roof. They're sitting there and they're so crowded in here that they can't hardly move. All of a sudden, the roof starts falling apart. And here comes this guy he's on a gurney kind of, and they're lowering him down. And all the scribes and Pharisees, they start harumphing because it's kind of taking away their limelight. And Jesus says, his sins are forgiven. And they were like, and by the way, you can get up and walk too. And they were like, oh, no. We're not going to have that. And so all this stuff is going on. And his parents, as they're outside, they're like, tell him to come outside. Tell him to come here. Tell him to come see. And he says, I got business in here. And Mark 3, verse 20, it says, his family thought he was out of his mind. He was nuts. It says the same thing here. His family didn't believe in him. So the one thing you can start to figure out is when you become a follower of Christ, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when people start thinking you're out of your mind. Don't be surprised when you're not necessarily, quote, blessed in the way that we think we ought to be blessed in the world. So that's his own family. It says Jesus went anyway, and he kind of went undercover, incognito, and the people, what you discover when you read these 3 chapters is the people were confused, the people were polarized, the people were angry, some were allies, some were enemies. Everybody's there. Now, what was it that started these people off to make him king just a few days before that? He fed them. And they were ready to make him king. Now, he's given them this difficult words about, look, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood. And they're like, well, I don't want to do that. And that's the second thing about Jesus is we want to commit to the Jesus that we want, and we don't want to necessarily just put the whole thing on and have to deal with it. So he heals a disabled man. He demonstrated what he was doing, all the things he was doing. It was the only thing that God can do. Nobody else can do this stuff. Many, it says that they were ready to, in fact, they weren't ready to abandon Jesus. They did. But there were still people going, hey, isn't he Messiah? I mean, who else could do this stuff? And they're all confused. And then some started, well, he can't be the Messiah because he comes from Galilee. Well, that tells you that they didn't know his whole birth story. They didn't know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But 742, chapter 7, verse 42 tells us that was exactly what they needed to find out. So, misinformation. One of the things we deal with about Jesus today is just misinformation. You'll talk to some people and they'll go, well, we don't even know that he really existed. That's one of the best attested to things in ancient history. If we don't know that, we don't know anything in ancient history at all. But they'll say it because they don't know any better. So then we get to this story, which is a great story about the woman who was caught in sin. It's almost certainly not part of the original text. It was inserted later. And you go, oh, wow, does that mean everything in the Bible's jacked up? No, it means that one of the first things your Bible probably tells you at the bottom, this was not in the earliest manuscripts. This was inserted later. But even the skeptics who are skeptical would read this and go, this probably happened at some point in time. It just got stuck here. Why? Because it teaches such a radical view of forgiveness, a view that would not be in place at all at that time. We know the story. The woman's caught in adultery. And what were the men fixing to do? Give me the rocks. Give me the rocks. And Jesus walks up and he says, who has the right to throw the first stone? Because they're insistent. We caught her. Which kind of makes them peeping Toms, I think, but that's a little weird, but I'm not sure how far you want to get into that. But at any rate, he says, well, here's a rock. Throw it if you got a right to. We need to be careful about what he's saying there. There are times when we need to defend Jesus, but we need to be careful when we're doing that. We're not throwing rocks in the same manner that these people were. Our defense of Jesus needs to be one that brings us to the proper point, and as we're going to see, it can be pretty strong in just a second. But it brings us there without it being about us. And so he just basically said, well, here, if you're without sin, throw the first stone. I'm wondering what he wrote in the dirt. We've all wondered that. It kind of makes me think of that what was that app where everybody got in trouble? Madison.
I think it was Ashley Madison.
Ashley Madison. It was a dating app on that ran amok. Basically, it was a hookup site. Is what it was, and people that were all married were getting on this site, and they were getting hooked up. Well, guess what happened? We got hacked. Whoops! And the names came out, and then all of a sudden, people were, well, it's not a good sign when you're the when you're the head deacon in your church, and these aren't exactly the kind of deaconating kinds of activities you need to be involved in, right? I think it was probably something like that. There's probably some of these people that were sitting there, and he just goes, AP. And all of a sudden, AP is looking over the top of his shoulder. And some of these things that he starts writing down are kind of like, I just should not have that talked about. And then there's TC, yeah. And TC is kind of, and it's like, I'm going to throw my rocks down too. And it's probably some things like that going on. Whatever he was writing in the dirt was kind of like a, whoa, buddy, we don't need to be here. And it says that all the people left. But now here's the interesting thing. The only people that are left there are Jesus and the lady. And he says, if you're not condemned, neither do I condemn you. But then he makes this very important statement. Don't go do that anymore. And I think sometimes we treat Jesus as the guy who takes all of our scabs off, but we don't realize that part of our responsibility is to quit getting scabs. Don't stand in front of a train and complain that the train ran over you. Well, of course it did. If you hang out on Bourbon Street doing all the things that the revelers are doing during Mardi Gras, well, what can I tell you? It's like, don't do that. And so there's that point of when we are changed by Christ, there's this expectation of act like it. Now, we used an example today in when we were talking, but it's a very good example. If you go to a car show and you look out there and here's this car roped off, and it says 1969 Plymouth Barracuda 426 Hemi convertible yellow 4-speed. There's only about 20 of them made. I mean, there's just none left anymore. You're looking at $5 or $6 million. and it's roped off for a reason. Don't go there, because it's supposed to be sacred, holy, if you will. Not in the real sense, but in the sense of the car world. You don't jump this thing, get on top of the hood and say, here, somebody take a selfie real quick. That's not the way this works. It's supposed to be given respect. Well, the notion that the holiest of holies was here in human form, but yet we somehow treat him like, well, I can just jump up there and muddy his bumpers anytime I want to, is a weird, it's a weird miscommunication of what it means to be holy, what it means to be changed. The lady was just saved from being stoned. You shouldn't have to tell her, now look, don't go put that fork in that light socket again. Because if you do, it's probably going to turn out just like it did the last time. So you know that there was gratitude there, but what happens to our gratitude over time? It goes away, right? But we got to remember that some of these things that are happening, they happen to us too. They're just in a little bit different context. So the lady, that conversation was probably almost certainly inserted at a later date. Okay. But it's also very likely to be a pretty accurate rendering of what Jesus actually did and said at some point. But the rest of it, when we get past that and you get back into the conversation, it's a clear picture of the hostility with some who John say in verse 30 believed in him. So is it possible to believe in Jesus and not to believe in Jesus? And the answer is yes. The way the word John uses the word, there's a difference between believing in Jesus and then having authentic faith in Jesus. Many of these people obviously believed that Jesus was a miracle worker. Why? They ate the bread and they ate the fish. Many of these people believed that he could do incredible things. Why? Because they saw a man healed after they had been in a pool for 38 years. There were all kinds of reasons why they knew that he was someone different, but that doesn't mean that they were ready to put their faith in him when he said, well, if you're going to follow me, there's this little problem, but you really got to commit to it. And they were like, well, we don't want to do that. So be careful when you read the word believe in John, because there's two different kinds. John discriminates. There's a belief, yeah, I know who he is, but then there's a belief, yeah, but that's the belief that changed me. This belief is not the same as this belief. In John 2:23, he says, many believed in his name. But then in verse 14, he said, Jesus wouldn't entrust himself to them because he knew they weren't going to stick around. So Jesus expects us to stick around. And so in verse 31 of chapter 8, he says, to the Jews who had believed in him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And this is where it got interesting, because he was talking to a bunch of religious folks, and they said, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. Little chest beating going on there, right? How can you say that we shall be set free? And Jesus replies, well, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So he's talking about slaves and sons here. You're a slave to sin, but you are a son of God. That's what he's telling them. And if you are set free by the Son, you will be set free together, indeed, because according to that, you are now part of the family of God forever. Well, that just went right over their head. I know that you're Abraham's descendants, yet you're looking for a way to kill me because you have no room for my word. I'm telling you that what I've seen is in the Father's presence, and you're doing what you have heard from your father. So he starts getting a little cryptic, but he's basically baiting the hook. Abraham's our father, they answered. And Jesus says, well, if you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. As it is, you are looking for a way to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. Abraham did not do such things. You are doing the works of your own father. We ain't no illegitimate children, they said. The only father we have is God himself. And Jesus said, If God were your Father, you would love me, for I've come here from God. I have not come on my own. God sent me. Why can't you understand me? It's because you are unable to hear what I say, because you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning. He never held to the truth. There's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is the father of lies. I tell you the truth, and you won't believe me. Can any of you prove me guilty of sin? And that's where he's going with that. If you can't, then I'm telling the truth. If I'm telling the truth, why don't you believe me? If you, whoever belongs to God, here's what God says. The reason you hear is that you do not hear is that you do not belong to God. Well, now it's gotten personal. And he didn't blink when this was said, because these people are clearly trying to use their religious position to justify themselves in front of God. And there's another point for all of us. Quit trying to use your position, either as whatever it is in this world that you have or have not accomplished. It means nothing to God in terms of being a respecter of man. Some of the things we've accomplished have been very God-driven. I have said this before and I mean it. Anything that I've done wrong in my life, you can give it to me. Anything that I've done right in my life, you can give it to God. Because pretty much that's the way it works. Every time I manage to screw it up, that'd be on me. The few, precious few times I've got it right, that'd be on God. I'm afraid most of the time there's more stuff on me than there is on God. But that, in a nutshell, is what he's saying right here. And the Jews said, we know, aren't we right? In other words, you wrong, dude, in saying that you are nothing except a Samaritan and demon-possessed. Well, now they just went to insults. Samaritan, you're just a half-breed. Well, that's factually incorrect. He was not a Samaritan. And aren't you demon-possessed? He says, he didn't even answer the first one. I'm not possessed by a demon. But I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. I am not seeking glory for myself, but there is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. I tell you, whoever obeys my words will never see death. So there's another point here. If you honor Christ, there's going to be times when you get dishonored. Deal with it. It's coming. The big point he makes here is don't seek glory for yourself. When you get persecuted, quit trying to have a pity party. Now, I don't mean that the wrong way, because persecution, when it comes, definitely deserves the kind of people around you who are willing to stand with you in your persecution. But there's a difference between recognizing that you're being persecuted for the right reason and demanding justice in this world. Hitler never got justice. Hitler killed 14 million people, give or take a few. And then at the end of it, he just said, oh, what the heck, I'll blow my brains out. He didn't have any accountability on this earth. None. If you're looking for justice and you look at that, you would say Hitler has not had justice. But Scripture teaches Hitler will have justice. There'll come a time when Hitler will answer for his actions. Many of the things that have been done wrong to us on this earth will not be righted on this earth. It's just not going to happen. But justice will come. But the justice has to be if we're not seeking glory for ourselves. We have to be careful about that. Because if we're seeking glory for ourselves, it's no longer about Christ. It's about what? Me. It's not Christ being glorified through me and my suffering. It's me being martyred, and I want everyone to know it. I'd like a statue in my place, please, that indicates how virtuous I was. Well, if that's the deal, we have corrupted what the justice is really going to be. I got to tell you, when you look around this world, there is not a lot of justice. You just don't see it. People do things that are wrong to other people all the time and get away with it, or seemingly get away with it. In fact, in this world, sometimes not only do they get away with it, they are rewarded for it. Many places and corporations, the way that you get to the top is you step on somebody else's shoulders and feet and everything else on the way up there. And then when you get there, you better dang well make sure that you're protected, because guess what the other people are trying to do? They're trying to chop your legs out. And in the middle of that, we're supposed to be Christ-like. Well, we have to be mindful. Can you work in these? Yes, you can thrive in these positions. But if you're not careful, you can lose your soul too. And these things are all around us. But when we're looking for justice, be careful. It's not necessarily going to come on the time frame that we expect. So he says, whoever obeys my word will never see death. Well, that ticked them off. Now we know that you're demon-possessed. Abraham died, the prophets died, and you say that whoever obeys your word will never taste death. In other words, he just put himself above what? The prophets and Abraham. Well, harumph. Are you greater than our father Abraham? He died. Well, who do you think you are? And Jesus says this, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. Now, if those words come from Christ, what do they think they mean to us? Wade said, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. Amen. But how many times do we try to glorify ourselves? My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. You don't know him. I know him. And if I said I did not, I would be a liar. But I do know him. I obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. In other words, he knew there was a Redeemer coming. You are not yet 50 years old, they said, and you've seen Abraham? Very truly, Jesus said, before Abraham was born, I am. Whoa. Well, he just declared himself what? God, divine. At this, they picked up stones. But Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. How could he hide himself? Because it was Mardi Gras. It was a Feast of Tabernacles. There are people everywhere. And there's these huge crowds, and they're tumultuous. And some are for him, and some are against him. And it's kind of like probably some of the people were trying to protect him. Some of the people were trying to get at him. Chaos! And he manages to escape. Well, in that exchange in particular, Jesus pulls no punches. He tells his audience, you belong to the father, the devil. Now, the reason he said that is because he had made it perfectly clear to them, there's a better choice here. I have shown you who I am. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. But when they absolutely refused it, he said, well, then let me tell you who you are, because that was really the only answer that there could be. It wasn't that Jesus was necessarily trying to provoke them. He probably was to some extent, because he knew that this was going to lead to the cross. But more importantly, he was basically just telling them, this is the only option left. If you won't accept what I'm telling you, then what do you think you have left? You can't just keep making this stuff up and making your own rules. So now Jesus sounds like an Old Testament prophet at that point. And he challenged them directly with their sins. Well, how bad did it get? After he I am'd them, how bad did it get? John 9 tells us that Jewish leaders kicked folks out of the temple if they dared state they believed Jesus was the Messiah. Ooh. Now we're talking about power in politics. Because these are people who had seen a blind man walking with his mat. How bad did it get? Those getting kicked out included that blind man. The leaders threw a man out of the temple they knew had been blind. They knew it. When the man told them who had healed him, they wanted to know how. Wow. I get that. But what does that tell you? And a man who could now see said, well, why are you asking me? You want to know that? Go ask him. All I know is it worked. They kicked him out. They got mad at him. They gnashed their teeth and said, who are you to talk to us? We are the sons of Moses, if you will. We know what we need to know, and you're clearly not part of this conversation. So when you go home today, read 7, 8, and 9. When you read it, think about the Feast of Tabernacles. Think about that this was an 8-day celebration. Think about that on the last day there was no candle lit, and Jesus calls himself the light of the world. Think about that there was no celebration of water being drank, no ceremonial drinking of water from the pool on the last day. And Jesus says, I am the living water. Think about how this started to offend these people. Think about how they started to approach him and directly challenge him. Think about how his own family didn't believe in him. Think about how all of that applies to us, because what you're beginning to see here is the real Jesus being challenged by the people and how he responded. And that's, if you read 7, 8, and 9 together, they should be linked together, because all of these are examples of that kind of action and then reaction. Jesus would act, they would react, and then Jesus would just basically, at this point, he is defining his ministry now. He's done his miracles. We'll still see a few more miracles, but the miracles were the ones that drew all this together, but the miracles were for the message. The message was not that there are miracles. And we've lost that in the church today sometimes. We want to make the message about the miracle. We want to make the message about the man that was healed at the pool. Yes, 38 years. But what does that obviously tell you? How many people were at the pool trying to be healed? Lots. What about the rest of them? The message is not about the miracles. The miracles bring you to the message. But sometimes in today's church, we think that we're going to heal. Everything's about God healing me of this or God healing me of that. We want the miracle, but we forget the message. The message was justice is coming. That'll all take care of itself. You can be a part of my family. You can be my son, which guarantees you that you will be my son or my daughter forever. Or you can be part of the family of Satan. That's like, wow, these are hard words, but they're also great words. If the man can walk on water and heal people and feed 5,000 folks, he's worth listening to. That's what he's saying. So my first question is, why do you expect your life to be blessed? And you know what I mean by that. We expect it to kind of be, we want it to be. We all do. We want it to be roses and all the nice things. But Jesus is doing all the right things at this time, exactly how they should have been done. And what's the response? The leaders want to kill him. Are you surprised that you've got some Hanyak that you work for that wants to drive you crazy? Are you surprised that you got people that want to cut your legs out from under you sometimes? They wanted to kill the guy who was doing miracles. Why do you expect your life to be blessed? And the problem is because sometimes we look at the miracle and we forget it's the message. It's the message. It's the Burrell Fridge who lived his life disabled. And if you're from Livingston Parish, you knew Burrell. He was a living legend. Burrell was never healed. Burrell was just as disabled on the day that he left this planet as he was from the day when he started this planet. Except in the middle of that, Burrell got ran over trying to sell peanuts on the side of the road one time, and that crippled him even up worse than he was to begin with. Burrell was not expecting a healing on this earth. In fact, when you talk to Burrell, he'd tell you, I'm probably the most blessed man in the world. What was that? Who's the guy that played for the Yankees? I'm the luckiest man in the world. Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig. Yes. How can you be the luckiest man in the world? You've got a disease named after you now. And it's because the miracle, in this case, is the message. The miracle is justice in this world is almost irrelevant compared to the eternity of justice that will take place, where you can either be a son or a daughter of God, or you can be from the family of Satan. That's how clear-cut it was. So when we ask for blessings, we have to be careful. Yes, it is proper to pray, God, take this away from me. Did Paul do that? Yes, time and time and time. So it's okay. It's not like, gee, should I be guilty about asking God to take this away? No. But at the same time, don't let the miracle mess with the message. With all the evidence that was in front of them, the leaders would not be convinced. How many times have you seen that? Where you just deal with people, they are stumps. Stumps. When we moved to Auburn, God bless him, there was a guy there who tried to tell me that they sold beer in Tiger Stadium. No, they don't. Yes, they do. No, they don't. I started going to ball games with my uncle when I was 5 years old. They had a family section in the south end zone. The kids' tickets were $2. And my uncle brought me to the games. Why did my uncle bring me to the games? Because my dad died when I was 2. So my uncle was really kind of doing the daddy kind of thing, right? But we sat there for a long time, and I can assure you, I was there long enough to know they never sold beer in Tiger Stadium. Didn't matter. This guy was a stump. Yes, they do. And finally I said, now that they built these add-ons, right? The big things they're not really part of Tiger Stadium. When they built those, they did that intentionally. They're not technically connected, which meant that they could do what? They could sell alcohol. And then the legislature or somebody made a law somewhere and they said, look, it's okay for everybody to get liquored up at ball games. That's good, because until then, nobody went to a game at Tiger Stadium under the influence. So now that has been unleashed, we don't have that problem anymore. But this guy was a stump. And it finally just occurred to me, why am I arguing with a stump? And the Bible even says that. Don't throw your pearls before swine. If you get to the point that you're talking to someone and they insist that a square is a circle and a circle is a square, and you do everything you can to provide that information that it's not, you're talking to a move on. God says that's okay. And Jesus, when he's looking at these people, he's basically could have said what? You're just a bunch of stumps. You won't listen to a word I've said. So why is it? I don't know. I think it's got something to do with power, and it's got something to do with position, and it's got something to do with pride. Some people just can't say, I'm wrong. If you ever watched Happy Days, Fonzie could never admit he was wrong. We thought that was cool. Well, it's not. It's a bad character flaw to just simply go, I pooped in my soup, guys. Sorry about that. But some people can't do that. And as a result, you don't want to eat their soup. Careful who's cooking your soup. Number 3, Jesus offends. He is offensive sometimes. He is a loving, caring, forgiving, but he's also just and holy. And when you tell somebody that they're of the devil, you're not really trying to go, now let me be sweet Jesus at this moment. Let me, hey, I don't want to step on anybody's toes. The prosperity gospel tells us that everything is going to be all right. That's not what Jesus was doing. So when he offends, we need to be careful, though. Don't be so quick to think that we can do a good job of copying Jesus in this regard, because I've seen some really offensive Christians before that were not doing any kind of thing in God's way. I've seen the guy standing in Free Speech Alley hollering at people that they're going to hell. I've seen the church that shows up at the funerals of people screaming that all homosexuals are hellbound. I've seen this. This is not the kind of offense that Jesus is talking about. But yet it's the kind of arrogance that we assume. So when I say that Jesus offends, he offends those people who simply will not take the evidence. It's not like Jesus showed these people 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. It's like you have been beat over the head with a shovel that contains nothing but truth. But stumps are pretty good at getting beat over the head with shovels. So there it is. If that offends you, you're just going to have to get offended. But it's not that he went to offend them. It's just that he basically stayed with the truth. But be careful. We are told that we're supposed to preach Christ and him crucified. That's our job. That's our mission. That means we have to be able to speak about the crucifixion, and we have to be able to speak about Christ. We're getting to the crucifixion. And then it says, when we are persecuted, we are blessed. Now that sure doesn't sound like the life of being blessed that some people want to pick, but it's there. So yes, persecution is a form of blessing in the Christian world. but I'm going to still be careful whose soup I'm eating. And here's a question. How could so many people be so confused in such a short amount of time? These people are like feral cats that you're trying to baptize. They are all over the place. It is unbelievable. On the one hand, just a few days before, let's make him king. And then a little bit later, it's like, we need to get rid of this guy. How bad does it get? The triumphal entry. Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They are fired up. We got our man. He's here. He's ready. 5 days later, what do we hear? Crucifying. We got no king but Caesar. Who is this dude? What does this tell you about people? We are about as fickle can get. I haven't had a chance to say fickle in quite a while, so I want to really put some emphasis on that. Fickle. Wow. How in the world is it that the human mind can go from I know what is true to I know it's not true? I don't know. In the War of the Worlds, Orson Welles had to keep coming on and going, this is a radio show. This ain't real. And what do people do? It's on the radio. The Martians are here. We will suck up any disinformation and believe it. You don't think that's the case? Listen to some of the gossip that you hear. And it's like, now if you gave that 1/10 of a second to analyze, you would know that that's really bad soup. But no. Did you know what I heard? I heard that there are people underground that are being used as food and body parts. They keep them in these tunnels and subways. You heard that, did you? Yes. And it's true. I read it on the internet. George Washington said it. Now, no one ever stopped to think about how do you feed these people? How do you keep them sanitized? I mean, in World War II, they put the Brits in the subways, and what's the first thing that happened to everybody? They got sick. They got really sick. They started figuring out we're going to have to fumigate this place. We're going to have to do this on a daily basis because all you were doing was how in the world do so many people get so confused in such a short amount of time? How could they not connect the miracles to the words about living waters and light of the world? It's not that they couldn't. It's that they wouldn't. And that's where we are spiritually. We are sometimes stumps. And we got to make sure we got to just move away from that. And we got to realize that some of the people we're dealing with are stumps. We got to realize that they will hurt us if they get the chance. They will screw you over if they get the chance. And then when that happens, you're being persecuted for Christ's sake. When that happens, that can glorify Christ if you allow it to. Boy, the Christian message is radical. It is not of this world. And the people who insist on being in this world, they can't take it. And so you're going to have to be that person that can be gracious in the middle of some entirely ungracious things sometimes. 7, 8, and 9. Boy, the tone just changes. Go read them. Read them in this context. It'll take you 10 minutes. And when you read it now, you're kind of going, wow, I see it. I see it. I see how this is making. I see how this is the types of people that would want to kill Jesus because all he did was tell the truth. So now we'll start moving towards the cross. And there's details there that are just fantastic, unbelievable. So Father, we thank you for the opportunity to be here today. May we not be stumps, although oftentimes we are. May we realize that when we said we have believing faith in you, we become, as you described it, a member of the family, a son or a daughter of God for the family forever, never to be taken out. This is the assurance that we have that eternity provides justice. Eternity makes things right. And that is the hope, the promise that everything that we have. Because the fact of the matter is, in this world, we are so often powerless to do much about the things that should have something done about them. But we're not powerless in the sense that even though these things have happened, we have the choice to react as Christ reacted. May we be infused with his courage and his guidance as we step into the world and try to make a difference in a world that oftentimes wants nothing to do with us. We ask these things in a humble spirit of thanksgiving. And if it's okay with you, you can get the gnats out of here before next week. It's in your Son's name we pray.